Now, our next guest would feel right at home in the pits at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or maybe at the racetrack. Why? Because these are three eminent researchers and experts on prediction markets, the place where financial instruments meet up with the wisdom of the crowd. So please welcome Professors Robin Hanson of George Mason University, Sanmay of Virginia Tech, along with Microsoft Research's own David Pennock. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here. Let's start with you, Robin. Talk about prediction markets. What is it? How does it operate?
Like you said, it's like a betting market or a stock market. The difference is that you're predicting some specific event, like whether your team will make its deadline. And the idea is to get people to say what they really think in forecasting to make a betting market odds, a consensus odds that we can then use to decide, will the project make the deadline?
So a lot of folks are saying, wait, predictions, betting, Sanmay, could I go to Vegas using prediction? Could I use this and just go lay down some money?
Well, theoretically you could, but the whole idea over there would be that you would run a prediction market to try and figure out what people think about something. So if you think that people out there have a really good idea about what is the probability that a certain event will occur, you could run a prediction market on this, try to aggregate the wisdom of the crowd into a particular number, and then if you believe that that's better than your own estimate or the odds that are being set in Vegas, which typically tend to be pretty good, by the way, they're running their own types of prediction markets, then you could go and trade based on that information. But essentially, Vegas is performing the same function when they set odds as many prediction markets are performing.
Okay, David, we're going in order here, going right down the line. Prediction markets, they sort of tap into the wisdom of the crowd, as you mentioned. It's sort of a collective wisdom. Is it more reliable than the opinions of like a handful of experts, when it comes to scientific polling here? Yeah. Is that true? No?
Yeah, empirically that is true. That in particular, individual experts are notoriously bad at making predictions. Often they're overconfident, and the more confident they are, the less accurate they are sometimes. So specifically, one or two experts relying on that is not a good idea. Trying to average several experts is better, and maybe even better yet is a whole crowd of people.
So it seems like prediction markets work sort of like commodities option exchange there. Can I make real money on prediction markets, like options on pork bellies, something like that?
So options is a form of prediction market.
Yeah.
It's predicting something about commodities. But the idea here is taking that power and using it to predict other things that you're interested in, like election outcomes, like deadlines inside of a company, like product sales inside of a company. So taking the same forces that work on Wall Street, but harnessing that for other purposes.
Where you can make money isn't the question. The question is, what do you want to know the answer to?
Right.
Do you want to know how much sales will be? Do you want to know if the project will make the deadline? If that's your question, then the answer might be make a prediction market, let other people bet on it, and they will tell you the answer to your question.
Okay. All right. So I was encouraged to, play around with the stock exchange, research to prep for this interview, but with play money. But of course, doesn't that sort of mess up the whole wisdom of the crowd? Sanmay, you could take this one. If I have nothing at stake, what's to stop me from, predicting Jackie Chan's going to win the Oscar next year?
Well, so that's a very good question, actually. And one of the distinctions that we often talk about in prediction markets research is between play money and real money markets. In real money, there's actual money at stake. In play money markets, which are run, in many different ways, people aren't necessarily, putting actual dollars on the line, but instead they could be playing a game. They could be, there could be many other types of incentives. People might care about their reputations, and these reputations might be publicly broadcast. And there is actually plenty of research that shows that that you don't always need real money to get people to actually actively participate and reveal their wisdom. Of course, it helps when you can use real money as well, and that's a very strong incentive. So I think that there are situations in which both real money and play money markets work pretty well.
Let's talk about some of your individual research projects, and we'll start. Dave, I understand that your work's focusing on combinatorial markets. Help somebody like me understand, what are those? How does that work?
Right. So the idea there is, think about the election, and you can imagine a traditional market would predict, say, who would win in all 50 states individually. What a combinatorial market will do is allow you to take those 50 variables, each one, say, binary, either Obama or Romney will win, and you can bet on not just each state individually, but all possible combinations of those things. So any Boolean function of those 50 variables. So combinations like Ohio and Florida, or more complex combinations like Obama will win between 6 and 8 states that begin with the letter M. So it allows you to create, if there's 50 states, that means there's 2 to the 50 possible outcomes in this space, which means there's actually 2 to the 50 possible predictions you can make, which is a number that's bigger than a Google, although smaller than a Googleplex. So something to
Tylenol, please. We're here.
to work on for next year.
Well, Sanmay, you've sort of created like this really unique institute, basically your own kind of prediction market that allows students, right, to sort of evaluate the effectiveness of their teachers. And this isn't like the old exit surveys where you did the bubbles. My teacher was above average, right? This is different.
Well, what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to predict what the outcome will be when you fill in those bubbles at the end of the semester. So, given that we're academics, we of course care about what goes on in our classrooms. And one of the things that some of my colleagues and I were thinking about was, we only get these evaluations at the end of the semester that tell us things like, oh, we thought you did an above average job, or we thought you did a good job. And sometimes students will write down some comments that may be useful, but there's really a lack of dynamic feedback. I could never trace that back to saying something like, hey, you did a really good job when you were teaching the section of the class on prediction markets, but you didn't do as good a job when you were talking about pork bellies, right? So what we thought was, wouldn't it be nice if we could have some way of providing dynamic feedback to instructors in this kind of setting, the same way that election markets, for example, provide dynamic feedback to candidates on, how's your re-election campaign going?
Right.
So, for example, when President Obama had a bad first debate, you could see that his price fell in the prediction markets for being re-elected. In the same way, if you're an instructor, maybe you give a bad lecture and you see your price fall in the instructor rating markets, that might tell you, hey, you gave a bad lecture, you could try to improve this lecture next year and therefore improve your teaching. And so we designed and deployed these markets as sort of a pilot project to see if these could in fact be useful, because they also raise many interesting questions, because in this case, the actual people who are participating in the market are also the people who are controlling the outcome of the market. So they're trading on the same outcomes that they're actually influencing. And so this raises questions of manipulation, of insider information, and will these markets actually end up being useful? And I'm happy to report that at least in our pilot deployment, we got some very encouraging results, and we think that the prices were actually useful in forecasting the kinds of ratings the instructors would get.
Now, I would imagine this has to be a relatively smaller market compared to the big online prediction markets. What does size have to do in correlation to the predictive results?
So that's a really good question. So when we ran these markets, we had approximately 200 people participating in these markets, but this was across 10 different classes. And the number of people who were actively rating any of these classes ranged from 5 to 30. So there were some markets in which there were a very small number of raters, and so therefore they potentially had an outsized influence on the outcome of that market. But we still managed to get a good amount of information from this, and this is encouraging for future research on prediction markets, because we know that very large-scale things like presidential re-election markets work pretty well. But for example, you typically don't run markets on things like the re-election in a congressional race, just because people often think that they're too small and illiquid to run on things like that. But we think that this is a proof of concept that it might be possible if you provide enough liquidity, if you have the right incentives to get people to participate in these smaller markets and actually to provide useful information even when it's not on such a grand scale.
Wow. Robin, I was looking in your dossier, which maybe you didn't know we have. You've been involved in a lot of research using markets to make intelligence predictions like which party might form the next government in Israel, or how likely is it that Iran will develop a nuclear weapon by 2015. And in particular, you were involved in a project called Dagger.
Yes.
Right? What can you tell us about what you've learned without giving away any national security information? Because those guys in the dark suits over there are watching.
This is not a secret project. It's open.
Okay.
It's a research project. The government intelligence agencies said, this sounds interesting, let's try to apply it. And they set up a competition with several different teams, all forecasting the same questions that they chose, questions about various foreign events. And they asked us each to try different approaches so they could see which new kinds of approaches might work. And they had the kind of questions as you described. And they did a decent job of forecasting these various foreign events. Of course, we didn't have a control of other kinds of forecasts to compare it against. This was just comparing them against each other.
Do the managers of these companies get excited about this? They say, yeah, we like the predictions.
Well, I can't tell you how excited
No,
the intelligence
tell me. Just
agencies
whisper
are
it.
excited about these
Whisper it.
things. But outside of the Dagger Project, I work with ordinary companies and other organizations to try to apply prediction markets in their firms. And there I have a lot of experience trying prediction markets to forecast project completion dates, sales, competitor sales, things that are useful to companies.
Wow. All right. Well, in our remaining time, I want to sort of open the floor a little bit, go beyond just the questions I have. Let you guys discuss the future of prediction markets. Bigger, better, smaller, is that better? Combinatorial better? Prediction times, forecasting.
Well, one aspect that I see coming in the future is combining different ways to make predictions, but both the markets and, say, more machine learning-based methods, and ways to combine these two, either using machine learning to set the prior of the market or using machine learning on top of the market to combine it with other sources to yield even better predictions.
So I think one of the most interesting areas is how do we design these markets to get the kinds of outcomes that we want? So I think it's pretty clear that prediction markets could theoretically do a lot of things well, but I think there's some very interesting research challenges in figuring out how do you make markets liquid enough. So there's this classic problem of chicken and the egg in liquidity in markets, which is that liquidity is what gets more liquidity. If you don't have enough people coming out there and trading, then people are not incentivized to come out there and trade. And the whole power of prediction markets is in incentivizing people to come in and essentially put their money where their mouth is. So there's some very interesting questions at the intersection of, what's the kind of user interface that you need to get people to come in and trade? What are the kinds of pricing engines you need running at the back end of these kinds of things in order to make the markets liquid enough that people are excited to come and share their information, and that they know that they can take positions and get out of these positions as they would need to, and this would really make the markets function well in the long term. So I think that's a very interesting area.
As a researcher, I'd like to tell you that what we most need is more research. And there are lots of interesting research topics that we are all working on. But honestly, that's not what we most need. What we most need is to take the more basic technologies that have already been worked out pretty well and get them applied. A lot of what it takes to make an abstract technology useful in the real world is to work out all those practical details that abstract researchers like us don't really understand or appreciate. And that's why you actually try things out in real organizations with real problems and figure out what's actually going wrong or right there and work out the details. And that's what we most need.
Well, obviously, predictive markets could be helpful in a number of ways, certainly business and advertising. In fact, somebody from our online audience sent in a question saying, how could you apply predictive markets or combinatorial markets principles to assessing the power and effectiveness of brand messages before triggering an advertising campaign for mid-size or large brand or product launch? So how could these help before you decide you're going to unroll this great idea or product you have?
Well, one thing we can do is have conditional markets. That is, we could say, what will be the sales of this product if we go with this ad campaign, as opposed to if we go with this other ad campaign. So we can ask the participants in the market, show them both ad campaigns, and ask them to forecast the outcome conditional on the choice.
Sanmay, I saw a twinkle in your eye when I asked that question.
No, I mean, I think that's exactly the right thing to do, is to run these kinds of conditional markets that tell you these things. Going back to my research hat, this leads to all kinds of interesting new questions that Robin and others have thought a lot about as well, which is that once you introduce decisions that are contingent on the outcomes of markets, you introduce a whole new set of incentives and a whole new set of interesting problems as whether people can come in and manipulate these markets. Because suppose I really want a particular ad campaign launched, I have an incentive to go in there and change the outcome of the prediction market so that the ad campaign that I'm managing gets launched. And maybe I'll lose less money in the prediction market than I would get for getting my ad campaign launched. So that leads to all kinds of other interesting questions, is how do we structure these decision markets kind of in the right way?
Well, it certainly seems like prediction markets is something that is correlated to a lot of people are going to make the leaps to gambling and sports and all of these other things. Wait, couldn't I use it this way? We're just about out of time, but what are some final thoughts you want to leave folks with? As again, this is something you've been living and breathing. What do you want folks to know about prediction markets?
Try it. Give it a try.
I would say they're phenomenally useful potentially, and that we shouldn't necessarily just get worried about the potential for manipulation or bad outcomes. They have risks, they have benefits, just like everything else. We need to weigh the risks and the benefits and try them when we can. So I'm with Robin on this.
Yeah, and I would say that it would be great to have more government sponsorship, ability to use real money in more situations, because that's a barrier in some cases where we have to go to play money markets. It'd be nice to be able to experiment in small ways with these markets, because they do have a lot of potential, but then there's some of these legal and social barriers that we'd like to overcome.
Well, I have a prediction. Let me see. Looking up at the clock. Yep, I was right. We're out of time. That was uncanny how I came up with that. Gentlemen, thank you. Robin, Sanmay, David, thank you guys very much for your time. This is cool stuff, big brain stuff. Thanks for helping us take inside it there. The world of prediction markets, now you know.